The sight of them was an offense against the August sky. 21 steers, sleek as river stones, grazed in a basin of impossible green, while the rest of the county baked to the color of a biscuit. Their hides shone with health, their shadows were long and dark on clover that should have been dust. For months, the town of Promise had watched the sky for a sign of mercy and seen only a sheet of hammered brass. They had watched their own herds shrink, ribs showing like wreckage through taut hides, and now they had to watch Elspeth's cattle thrive. It was an unnatural thing, a quiet mockery that felt louder than any shouted boast. It was the kind of luck that curdled a neighbor's heart, because it wasn't luck at all. It was judgment. Silas Blackwood, whose own vast acreage was a study in brown and brittle stalks, felt the sight in his teeth like a grain of sand. He'd been the first to laugh. Now the sight of that green hollow and the 21 beasts that grazed within it was a knot in his gut he couldn't loosen. A woman alone, a parcel of land everyone knew was worthless, and 21 skeletal steers he himself had sold for pennies on the dollar. The arithmetic of it was an insult he could not swallow. He stood on the ridge overlooking her property, the heat a physical weight on his shoulders, and he counted them again. 21. The number felt like a curse. A whole town had agreed she'd lost her mind. Now, that same town was starting to wonder if she was the only one who'd ever had it. 3 months earlier, the air in the auction yard had been thick with the dust of desperation. It was May, but the rains had not come. The spring creeks were already summer low, and the prairie grass was thin and pale, lacking the deep green vigor it should have had. The auctioneer's voice was a tired drone, trying to wring value from a market flooded with panic. Ranchers were selling off their weakest stock, trying to save enough pasture for their core breeding herds. It was a buyer's market for anyone with grass and water, and a fool's errand for anyone without. Elspeth stood near the back, a still figure in a faded calico dress. She had been a widow for a year, a quiet presence in a town that measured a person by their noise and their acreage. Her husband had left her with little more than a deed to 80 acres everyone called the Sump, a shallow, useless basin of land that held water too long in a wet spring and baked to cracked clay in a dry summer. He had also left her with the memory of his quiet, observational ways, a habit of looking at what others overlooked. When the pen of 21 steers was let out, a collective sigh of pity went through the crowd. They were a sorry lot, more bone than flesh, their heads hanging low. They were the culls, the ones who wouldn't make it through a hard summer, even with good pasture. "What am I bid for this fine collection of hat racks?" the auctioneer called out, his attempt at humor falling flat. A few men chuckled without mirth. Silas Blackwood, leaning against a post with the easy confidence of a man who owned half the county, caught Elspeth's eye and gave a slight, condescending shake of his head, a gesture that said, "Even you aren't foolish enough for this." The bidding was non-existent. $1 a head, just to get them off the inventory," the auctioneer pleaded. Silence. These animals weren't an asset. They were a liability. They were 21 mouths to feed with grass that didn't exist. It was then that Elspeth raised her hand. A murmur went through the small crowd. Her voice, when it came, was clear and steady, not loud, but carrying in the anxious quiet. $22 for the lot. Blackwood pushed himself off the post. He strode over to her, his shadow falling across her. "Elspeth," he said, his voice a low thrum of false concern. "A young woman alone shouldn't be burdened with this. That's not a herd, that's a funeral procession. You'd do better to save your money for flour." She met his gaze without flinching. Her eyes were the color of a cloudy sky, revealing nothing. "I thank you for your concern, Mr. Blackwood." To the auctioneer, she said again, $22. The auctioneer, stunned, looked around. "Sold, then. To the widow." The word hung in the air, a label she wore like a shawl. As she went to settle the meager sum, she could hear the whispers behind her. Lost her senses. Grief does strange things. Throwing good money after bad. The sump will swallow them just like it swallowed her husband's hopes. Elspeth paid her money, took the bill of sale, and walked toward the holding pen, her back straight. She did not look at them. She did not need their pity, and she would not give them the satisfaction of an argument. She had her reasons. They were rooted in the land nobody wanted, and in a promise she had made to the quiet man who had taught her how to see. Driving the steers home was a slow, grim business. They moved like ghosts, a shuffling cloud of dust and bone. She walked behind them, a long switch in her hand, her gaze not on the pathetic animals, but on the horizon. The sump lay 2 miles from town, a dip in the prairie that was easy to miss. To most, it was a topographical mistake. In wet years, it became a stagnant marsh, breeding mosquitoes and sucking at the hooves of any creature foolish enough to wander in. In dry years, like this one promised to be, its surface was a mosaic of deep, hardened cracks. Her husband Jacob had seen something else. "It's a bowl, Elspeth," he'd told her one evening, his hands tracing its shape in the air. "Everything drains to it. The water doesn't just sit on top, it goes down. It's held there, deep, where the sun can't steal it." The town had called him a dreamer for buying it. They said he'd bought a mud hole. But he had spent hours walking it, studying the strange, tough reeds that grew in its lowest point. Reeds that stayed green a week or two longer than the surrounding prairie grass. He had died before he could test his theory. Now, the theory was all she had. As she neared her property line, she saw a figure waiting by the dilapidated fence. It was Mr. Sorensen, her nearest neighbor, an old Dane who had ranched this land for 50 years and spoke in short, cryptic sentences. He watched the sad parade of cattle approach, his deeply wrinkled face unreadable. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "They sell you their skeletons," he said. It was not a question. "The price was fair," Elspeth replied, her voice raspy with trail dust. Sorensen's pale blue eyes scanned the sorry herd, then moved to the cracked expanse of the sump behind his fence. He nodded slowly, a motion that seemed to begin somewhere deep in his bones. "Sky lies," he said, pointing a gnarled finger toward the brassy, cloudless expanse above them. "Ground tells truth. You listen down." He looked at her then, a real look, one that held no pity, only a kind of gruff appraisal. Jacob was a listener. With another nod, he turned and shuffled back toward his own small, tidy homestead. The exchange lasted no more than a minute, but it felt like a blessing. Sky lies. Ground tells truth. It was the core of Jacob's belief, now given voice by the oldest man on the prairie. It settled in her heart like a smooth, cool stone, calming the tremor of doubt that had been shaking her since the auction. She urged the cattle through the gate. Their hooves made a hollow, clattering sound on the baked earth. They stopped, heads down, too weary to even explore. They looked like a final admission of defeat. Elspeth stood watching them as the sun began to dip, painting the dusty sky in shades of apricot and rose. She began the arithmetic, the grim counting that would become her nightly ritual. 21 steers, 80 acres of cracked clay, a well that was deep but not inexhaustible, a small barn with perhaps a dozen bales of last year's hay saved for an emergency. This was the emergency. The numbers were stark and unforgiving. By any conventional logic, Silas Blackwood was right. This was a funeral procession. But she was banking on a different kind of logic, the logic of the ground. That night, she did not sleep. She sat at her small kitchen table with a lamp turned low, listening to the silence of the prairie, a silence that felt heavy, waiting. She was one person alone, and she had just gambled what little she had on a dead man's dream and an old man's riddle. The work began before the first hint of dawn. While the town slept, Elspeth was in the lowest part of the sump with a shovel and a pickaxe. The ground was brutally hard, a baked armor of clay. But Jacob had shown her where to look. Along the deepest curve of the basin, certain reeds grew in faint, almost imperceptible lines. "That's where the water is closest," he'd said, crumbling the dark, slightly damp soil between his fingers. "It's seeping up, just a little." Her plan was simple and backbreaking. She would help the water. She started digging a series of shallow trenches, no more than a foot deep, following the lines of the reeds. The work was punishing. The sun rose and the heat pressed down. Her hands, softened by a year of grieving, blistered and then bled. She wrapped them in rags and kept digging. The rhythmic scrape and thud of her tools was the only sound. The steers watched her with dull, incurious eyes. For the first week, she fed them the precious hay, a few forkfuls each, just enough to keep them on their feet. She hauled water from the well in buckets, a punishing, repetitive labor that stretched her muscles and burned her lungs. She was spending her last reserves, throwing every ounce of her energy and resources into this cracked piece of earth. After 3 days, a boy appeared at the fence line. It was Finn, the 10-year-old son of the Miller family, whose own farm was struggling badly. He was a skinny, quiet boy with watchful eyes. He said nothing, just stood and watched her work. On the 4th day, he came with a small pail of water from his own family's well. "Ma said you might need it," he mumbled, not meeting her eyes. Elspeth stopped her digging, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of a filthy forearm. She gave him a tired smile. "Tell your mother I'm grateful, Finn, but my well is still holding." The boy lingered. "What are you doing?" "Looking for water," she said simply. "There's no water here," he stated, with the flat certainty of a child repeating what he'd heard from his elders. "Everyone says this is the driest part of the county." "Everyone looks at the sky," Elspeth said, echoing Sorensen's words. "I'm listening to the ground." She struck the pickaxe into the earth, and this time it made a different sound. Not a sharp crack, but a dull, wet thud. She knelt and scooped away the clay. Beneath was a dark, cool mud, glistening with moisture. It wasn't a spring, not a gush of water, but a slow, steady seep. A dark patch began to spread around the hole. The boy's eyes went wide. By the end of the week, she had dug a network of shallow trenches, all of them glistening with a dark, life-giving dampness. She hadn't created a pond, but she had uncovered a vast, subterranean sponge. The ground itself was weeping water. Now came the second part of the plan. In the barn, under a dusty canvas, were the sacks Jacob had bought 2 years ago. The seed was a special mix he'd ordered from a catalog, a deep-rooted clover and a tough, broad-leafed grass blend meant for marshy, low-lying pastures. The town's ranchers, who prized the native blue stem of the high prairie, had laughed at him for it. "Farmers' weeds," they'd called it. Elspeth hauled the sacks to the basin. With Finn's help, they began to sow, walking the lines of the damp trenches and casting the seed onto the newly exposed, moist earth. Finn, his initial skepticism forgotten, was now her devoted shadow. He started calling the steers by names. The big, bony one was general. The one with a floppy ear was senator. The scrawniest one was tiny. The act of naming them was an act of faith. It transformed them from a doomed statistic into a cast of characters. It made Elspeth smile, a real smile that reached her eyes for the first time in a long time. The town's verdict, delivered at the general store, remained unchanged. "She's digging her own grave out there," one man said, shaking his head. "And now she's got the Miller boy helping her with her foolishness." But Elspeth didn't hear them. She was listening to the ground, and in the silent, pre-dawn coolness of the basin, she thought she could feel a faint, answering pulse of life begin to stir. By the end of June, the rest of the county was a landscape of grief. The prairie was leached of all color, a uniform shade of pale tan. The sun was relentless. Creeks had vanished, leaving behind winding scars of cracked mud and bleached stones. The price of hay had tripled, and there was none to be had. The air was filled with a constant, low bawling from starving herds. But in the sump, a miracle was unfolding in slow motion. The seeds had taken root in the damp earth of the trenches. Thin green shoots appeared, then thickened into a lush, vibrant carpet. The seeps, coaxed open by Elspeth's shovel, provided a steady, silent irrigation from below. The clover, with its deep taproots, thrived, drawing moisture from Jacob's hidden reservoir. The basin had become a secret garden, an emerald oasis in a desert of brown. Elspeth kept the steers on the outer edges of the sump, still supplementing their meager foraging with the last of her hay, forcing them to graze on the sun-scorched perimeter. She was saving the green heart of the basin, letting it grow thick and strong. It was her ace, her hidden weapon, and she guarded the sight of it fiercely. She and Finn strung a new fence line, enclosing the greenest part. "Why can't they eat it now?" Finn asked, his face smudged with dirt. "Because," Elspeth explained, her hands busy twisting wire. "Right now, it's just food. We have to wait until it's an advantage." The boy didn't fully understand, but he trusted her. The change in the cattle was gradual, then sudden. Their heads came up. The dullness left their eyes. As she slowly allowed them into the richer grazing at the edges of the green patch, they began to fill out. The sharp angles of their hips and shoulders softened. A gloss returned to their hides. They were still thin compared to a healthy herd in a good year, but they were no longer skeletons. They were survivors, gaining ground while everything around them was losing it. She kept her success like a coal banked low under ash. When she went to town for supplies, she deflected questions with quiet, non-committal answers. "How are those steers of yours?" someone would ask with a smirk. "They're holding on," she would say, her face calm, giving them nothing. It is easier to believe a thing is rotten than to admit you were wrong to mock it. The town continued to believe what it wanted to believe, that the widow was starving her cattle in a mud hole. Only Mr. Sorensen knew. He would sometimes appear at the fence line in the evenings, looking out over the basin. He never said much. One evening, he watched the steers grazing on the darkening grass and grunted. "Jacob was a good listener," he repeated. It was the highest praise he could offer. Elspeth felt a swell of pride. For the first time, she allowed herself a sliver of hope. The arithmetic was changing. 21 steers gaining weight. One basin of green growing deeper. The sky remained a merciless, empty blue, but the ground, the dark, faithful ground, was keeping its promise. She had listened down, and it was answering. Her gamble was starting to pay off, and the knowledge was a quiet, steady warmth inside her. She was still alone, but she was no longer adrift. She had a purpose, written in green on the cracked face of the land. August arrived like the open door of a furnace. The heat was suffocating, the dust so fine it coated the inside of every window, the back of every throat. The town of Promise was brittle with heat and fear. The final, pitiful sell-off had happened. Herds were decimated. The talk now was of the coming winter, of empty smokehouses and a long, hungry season. The mockery directed at Elspeth had evaporated, replaced by a strange, resentful silence. Her secret could not be kept forever. The ridge overlooking the sump was a public road, and anyone riding past could see it now, a slash of impossible green in a dead landscape, and 21 cattle growing fat within it. The sight bred disbelief, then envy, then a dark, simmering suspicion. No one could understand it. They invented stories to explain it. She'd found a hidden spring and was hoarding the water. She was using some kind of magic, some old country witchcraft. She was in league with something unnatural. The truth, that she had simply paid attention, that she had worked with the land instead of fighting it, was too simple, and therefore too damning for anyone to accept. One afternoon, a dust-covered buggy pulled up to her gate. It was a man she didn't know, dressed in city clothes, his face flushed from the heat. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat, "name's Abernathy. I'm a cattle agent out of Kansas City. I've been hearing some unlikely stories." Elspeth said nothing, simply waited. Her hands were stained with dirt, her face shaded by a wide-brimmed hat. "They say you have grass in this drought," he continued, his eyes scanning the parched land around her cabin, "and cattle that are fit for market." "They say a lot of things," Elspeth said evenly. "May I see for myself?" he asked. "A man in my position learns to follow even the most ridiculous rumors." She hesitated for a moment, then gave a slight nod. She led him not to the main basin, but to a small holding pen where she'd separated 3 of the healthiest steers. Abernathy stopped dead. He was a man who saw the world in terms of beef and bone, and he knew quality when he saw it. The steers were not prize winners, not yet. But in the context of this God-forsaken August, they were a miracle. Their flanks were filling out, their coats were healthy. He walked around them, his professional gaze missing nothing. He ran a hand over the back of the one Finn had named General. "Well, I'll be," he breathed. "The stories don't do it justice." He turned to Elspeth, his eyes sharp with calculation. "Ma'am, I'll give you $30 a head for the whole lot, right now. Cash money." It was a good price, a fair price for the time and place. It was more money than she had seen in 2 years. It was enough to secure her future, to prove everyone wrong. The arithmetic was simple. 21 times 30, a fortune. But Elspeth had been doing her own calculations for weeks. She knew what those steers represented. It wasn't just beef. It was security for an entire town facing a barren winter. It was leverage. "They're not ready yet," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Abernathy's eyebrows shot up. "Not ready? Ma'am, with respect, these are the only market-ready steers in 3 counties. In another month, you could name your price." "I know," she said. The simplicity of her answer seemed to unnerve him. He saw he was not dealing with a simple widow who had stumbled into dumb luck. He was dealing with a strategist. "I see," he said slowly, his respect for her growing. "Well, my offer stands. When you think they're ready, you send word to the hotel and promise. I'll be waiting." He tipped his hat again and left. The dust from his buggy had barely settled when another visitor arrived, Silas Blackwood, on his big bay horse. He didn't bother with the gate but rode right up to the pen, his gaze taking in the steers, then sweeping over her with a look of predatory appraisal. "Abernathy was just here," he stated. "Heard him making you an offer." He did, Elspeth confirmed. You were smart to turn him down, Blackwood said, his voice smooth as oil. A city man will always try to cheat a country woman. Now, I'm your neighbor. I want to see you do right. I'll give you 35 a head, more than he offered. I'll take them off your hands, save you the trouble. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. His gaze kept flicking toward the green basin, a flicker of raw greed she could almost taste. They're not for sale, Mr. Blackwood. His smile vanished. Now, Elspeth, don't be foolish. A woman alone can't manage a herd this valuable. You're going to have trouble. Rustlers, thieves. This kind of wealth attracts the wrong sort of attention. It's better to sell to a neighbor, someone who can protect your interests. The threat was veiled but unmistakable. He was telling her what would happen, not what might. I appreciate the warning, she said, her voice as level as the baked prairie. But my mind is made up. Blackwood stared at her for a long moment, his jaw tight. You will regret this, he said, his voice dropping to a low growl. He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of angry dust in his wake. Elspeth stood watching him go, her heart hammering against her ribs. The game had changed. Her secret was out, and the wolves were beginning to circle. The pressure began to build, silent and suffocating as the heat. Blackwood's threat lingered in the air. The nights felt different, less peaceful. Elspeth found herself waking at the slightest sound, the snap of a twig, the lowing of a steer. She started sleeping with her husband's old shotgun by the door, a cold and unfamiliar weight. Finn became her eyes and ears. The boy was small and quick, and he could move through the dusk like a shadow. He reported seeing horsemen on the ridge at night, men who sat their mounts for long periods just watching the basin. One evening, he came running to her, his face pale with alarm. "Mr. Blackwood's men," he whispered, breathless. "They were down by the south fence. They had shovels." Elspeth's blood ran cold. The south fence was where the basin was lowest, where the water seeped most strongly. It bordered Blackwood's own parched land. He wasn't just going to steal her cattle. He was going to try and steal her water, to dig a channel and divert the lifeblood of her land onto his own. Anger, hot and sharp, flared in her chest, but she pushed it down. Panic was a luxury she could not afford. She had to think. A direct confrontation was useless. It would be her word, a widow's word, against that of the most powerful man in the county. She needed a different kind of weapon. The next day she rode into town. The atmosphere in the general store was funereal. The shelves were thinly stocked. The faces of her neighbors were pinched and gray with worry. The talk was of leaving, of giving up and heading west. Pride was a thin commodity when children's bellies were empty. She saw Mrs. Miller, Finn's mother, her face a mask of exhaustion. She was trying to trade 2 laying hens for a small bag of flour, and the storekeeper was hesitating. This was the true cost of the drought. It wasn't just dead cattle, it was dying hope. Elspeth walked to the counter. She placed a small cloth bag down. The clink of coins was loud in the silent store. "I'll pay for Mrs. Miller's flour," she said, "and a bag of sugar and coffee for her as well." Every head in the store turned. Mrs. Miller stared at her, her eyes filling with tears. The storekeeper, a man who had been among the first to mock her, looked at the coins, then at Elspeth, a flicker of grudging respect in his eyes. On her way out, a man named Henderson, a small rancher whose herd was all but gone, stopped her on the porch. "Is it true, Elspeth?" he asked, his voice low. "What they're saying? That your cattle are fat?" "They're healthy," she corrected gently. "I was wondering, would you consider selling one? Just one? My family, we have nothing put away for winter." The raw desperation in his voice was a physical thing. He was a proud man, reduced to begging. This was Blackwood's true crime. It wasn't just the threat to her, but the way his greed held the whole town hostage. He had land and a deep well. He could have helped his neighbors, but instead he let them wither, hoping to buy their land for cents on the dollar when they finally broke. Elspeth looked at Henderson's cracked hands and his sun-scorched face. The moral arithmetic became suddenly, brutally clear. She could sell her herd to Abernathy for a fortune and leave this place behind. Or she could sell to Blackwood and live under his shadow. Or she could do something else entirely. "The steers will be ready in 2 weeks," she said, her voice carrying so that others on the porch could hear. "I'll be selling them." A murmur of interest went through the small group. "To that city buyer?" Henderson asked, his face falling. "He'll ship them all east." "No," Elspeth said, meeting the eyes of each person who was listening. "I'm selling them here. To anyone in Promise who needs meat for the winter. 1 animal per family." A stunned silence followed. "But we have no money," Henderson stammered. "The price will be fair," Elspeth said, "and I'll take payment in kind. Hay from next year's crop. Labor to repair my fences. A promise is worth as much as $1 to me." She had just declared war on Silas Blackwood, not with a gun, but with generosity. She was choosing to bind herself to the community that had scorned her, betting on their collective decency over one man's bottomless greed. It was the biggest gamble she had taken yet. The news spread through the town of Promise like a grass fire. Elspeth's offer was the only topic of conversation. It was an act of such unexpected grace that it disoriented people. They had settled into a narrative of her as a strange, lucky, and possibly selfish woman. Now they were forced to see her differently. For some, suspicion lingered. They saw a trick, a catch. For most, however, the offer was a lifeline they were desperate to grasp. It was hope, served up plain and simple. Silas Blackwood was furious. Elspeth's plan struck directly at his own. He had been waiting for the town to starve, to break, to come crawling to him. He wanted their land, their labor, their dignity. Elspeth was offering them a way to keep all 3. He confronted her on the main street 2 days later. He dismounted and stood in her path, his face dark with rage. "You think you can turn this town against me?" he snarled, his voice low and menacing. "I built this town." "I'm not turning anyone against you, Mr. Blackwood," Elspeth said, her voice calm. She stood her ground, not intimidated. "I'm just feeding my neighbors." "You're a fool," he spat. "You could have taken Abernathy's money. You could have been rich." "There are different kinds of rich, I suppose," she replied. Her stillness was more infuriating to him than any argument. It was as if she operated by a set of rules he did not recognize and therefore could not defeat. He saw that his threats had failed. He saw that his money had no power here. He had one card left to play: public humiliation. "How did you do it, Elspeth?" he called out, his voice ringing down the street, drawing onlookers from the store and the saloon. "How did a lone woman with no experience manage it? Where did all that water come from? Did you dam a public creek? Did you steal water that belongs to all of us?" The accusation hung in the hot, still air. It was a vile, clever lie. If he could paint her as a thief who had saved herself by robbing the community, he could poison her offer and turn the town against her. People hesitated, their faces clouded with doubt. It was an explanation that made a certain kind of sense. Elspeth felt a flicker of fear. He was twisting her hard work into a crime. Before she could answer, a new voice cut through the tension. "She did it with a shovel." Mr. Sorensen had come up beside her, his old, stooped frame suddenly looking as solid as an oak tree. He was holding a small clump of earth, dark and damp, with the green shoots of clover growing from it. "And with this," he said, holding it out for all to see, Ground tells truth. Another voice joined in. She did it by working when you were sleeping, Mr. Blackwood. It was Henderson, the rancher who had begged to buy a steer. He stepped forward, standing with Elspeth. My boy Finn saw your men with shovels by her fence line 2 nights ago. Weren't looking for water, were they? Or maybe they were. Her water. The accusation was flipped. The crowd murmured, their eyes turning from Elspeth to Blackwood. The story of his men at her fence line had spread. Now, connected to his public accusations, it looked exactly like what it was, the sour spite of a thwarted bully. Blackwood's face went from red to pale. He looked at the hard, accusing faces of the men and women he had considered his dependents. He saw he had miscalculated, had mistaken their desperation for weakness. He had lost. Without another word, he turned, mounted his horse, and rode out of town. A man diminished, his power broken by a quiet woman and a handful of clover. The day of the sale was a strange and solemn festival. It was not a boisterous auction, but a quiet, orderly gathering at the sump. One by one, the families of promise came. Elspeth stood with a ledger, a pencil in her hand. Finn, puffed up with importance, helped guide the chosen steers from the basin. They were magnificent animals now, heavy and calm, a testament to the quiet miracle of the green grass. Elspeth had set the price low, just enough to cover her initial investment and see her through the winter. As she'd promised, she accepted coin from those who had it, and promissory notes from those who didn't. Henderson pledged 2 weeks of labor to help her shore up the barn. Mrs. Miller, Finn's mother, promised a share of her quilts and canned goods. The blacksmith offered to shoe her horse for the next 2 years. Each transaction was a stitch, reweaving the frayed fabric of the community. They were binding themselves to her, and she to them. As each family led their animal away, the gratitude in their eyes was a reward far greater than any city buyer's cash. It was the look of people who had been pulled back from a precipice. They were not just buying meat, they were buying a future. They were buying back their pride. By late afternoon, only 3 steers remained. One for her, one for Mr. Sorensen, and one she had set aside for the Millers, a gift for Finn's loyalty. As the last wagon pulled away, Mr. Abernathy, the cattle agent, rode up. He had been watching from a distance. He dismounted and walked over to Elspeth, shaking his head in disbelief. "Ma'am," he said, his voice filled with a genuine awe, "I have been buying cattle for 30 years. I have seen men make fortunes, and I have seen men lose them, but I have never, ever seen what I saw here today." He looked from her to the faces of the departing townsfolk. "You could have sold this herd for 5 times what you did." "A thing's only worth what others will pay, Mr. Abernathy," Elspeth said, a small smile touching her lips. "But sometimes you get to choose who is doing the paying, and in what currency." He understood. He looked out over the green basin, now mostly empty but still vibrant, a promise of renewal. "If you ever decide to get back into the cattle business on a larger scale," he said, handing her his card, "you call me first. It would be an honor to do business with a woman who understands true value." He rode off, leaving Elspeth in the quiet of the evening. The air was beginning to cool. A thin veil of cloud, the first in months, was gathering on the western horizon. It might not bring rain, but it was a change, a sign. The long fever of the drought was finally breaking. Her victory was not loud. It was not a gloating triumph. It was as quiet and steady as the seep of water into the sump's soil. It was the feeling of a barn stocked for winter, the respect of her neighbors, and the security of a place earned not by force, but by wisdom and work. She had proven them all wrong, but more than that, she had proven her husband and herself right. The first rain came a week later, a soft, soaking drizzle that smelled of clean dust and thirsty earth. It fell for a whole day, washing the prairie clean, turning the tan hills to a soft, hopeful brown. The town of promise drank it in like a blessing. The winter was hard, as predicted, but it was not a winter of starvation. In every smokehouse there was beef. In every family there was a story told about the widow's steers. Elspeth was no longer the widow, an object of pity or scorn. She was Elspeth, a woman who listened to the ground. She was a fixture, a foundation stone. The community, bound to her by debts of gratitude and labor, became her own. Henderson and his sons arrived as promised and spent 2 weeks rebuilding her fences and strengthening her barn, their work solid and true. Mrs. Miller brought bread and preserves, and her friendship was a quiet, steady comfort. Silas Blackwood was a ghost. He kept to his own vast, empty ranch, isolated by a bitterness of his own making. His power, which had been built on the fear of scarcity, had crumbled in the face of one woman's abundance and her willingness to share it. He was a rich man with nothing of value. On a cool spring morning, Elspeth stood with Mr. Sorensen and Finn on the edge of the sump. The basin, grazed down to the roots, was already showing new life. The clover and deep-rooted grasses, nourished by the winter moisture, were pushing up, a vibrant, electric green. The 21 steers were gone, but the land remained, its promise renewed. Finn, no longer a shy, watchful boy but a confident young man, pointed to the sky. A flock of geese was flying north, their calls echoing in the clear air. It was a sign of the turning season, of life returning. Elspeth watched them, her heart full. She had survived. More than that, she had thrived. She had taken the thing no one wanted, the worthless land, the dying cattle, and coaxed from them not just wealth, but a community. She had learned the deep, true arithmetic of the prairie, where the answer was not always about profit, but about endurance, about generosity, about the quiet, unshakable truth of the ground beneath her feet. Mr. Sorensen stood beside her, packing his pipe. He looked from the greening earth to the wide blue sky, and then to her. "Sky lies," he said, his voice a gravelly murmur. "Ground tells truth." He lit his pipe, the smoke curling into the clean spring air. "Is good to have a neighbor who listens down." And Elspeth, who had learned to listen with her hands and her heart, knew she was finally home. She had found her place, not in the noise of the town, but in the deep, steady silence of the earth.